Hello, everybody. My name is Luke Rideout, and I messed up. That's the whole point of this talk. I messed up big time, and I want you to know about it, because hopefully you will mess up maybe 5% less than you might have otherwise, thanks to something I said today. I am the project director at a game studio called Beamdog, based in Canada. We're best known as the developers of the enhanced editions of a number of classic BioWare Dungeons & Dragons computer games like Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, Icewind Dale, and Neverwinter Nights. Over the course of what will be 3 years, in just over a month's time, my team and I have been working on a game called MythForce, Beamdog's first original IP. MythForce is a 4-player, cooperative, first-person fantasy dungeon-crawling roguelite with a distinctly 1980s cartoon aesthetic. The game released into early access on the Epic Games Store on April 20th of this year, and it was a true passion project for many of the members of my team. It's also a miracle that the game was ever made. Today, I'm here to talk about how we managed to build MythForce against what, in retrospect, were basically overwhelming odds. Thank you for the water. The production of MythForce was a masterclass in rookie mistakes made by veteran game developers, not willfully ignoring the classic lessons of what to do and not to do when making a game, but still violating those simple rules because, in most cases, it was the option that made the most sense at the time. This is the story how I, in particular, knew the rules and broke them all, like an idiot. But by the grace of a very understanding executive team and a very immensely talented development team, we still collectively shipped a game. You're probably not going to hear anything today that you haven't already heard in one form or another. I'll be repeating well-understood rules of game development, and I'll be telling you how and why we decided to break them, as well as how we survived breaking them. For those of you who are in the proverbial trenches, I apologize in advance for the anxiety that you're going to feel while I describe some of the things we did along the way while working on MythForce. Some of this is going to be chillingly familiar for many of you, I'm sure, because we as an industry love to make bad choices for good reasons. And I assure you, once again, that the choices that we made were all with the best of intentions, and at every juncture, they were the best choice that we could make at the time. So during this talk, I'm going to go over a few things: what brought us here, what we did wrong and why, and how we managed to survive making so many mistakes making this game. So let me start back at the beginning. October of 2019, shortly after Beamdog shipped the console ports of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and Icewind Dale and Planescape Torment. Fresh off the last project, we had a small group of folks who had been resourced to the Infinity Engine game projects that were not going to be moving to help finish Neverwinter Nights on console, which eventually go shipping in the following year. Instead of focusing on another port, we decided that it was time for us to take a shot at creating and releasing our own IP. In the background, a small team had been doing some ideation around a high-fidelity, dungeon-crawling roguelite informed by a shared enjoyment of the genre. We could use this first project to establish some core competencies in the team for our future projects, even if it was small in scope. As a business, we also wanted to make a game that was fun to play with friends. And with many of the senior team being parents of young kids, we wanted to make something that all ages could play without the fear of gore or grimness that is fairly common in the genre. So, core to the experience, in order to realize that business need, we decided that it should be multiplayer for the whole family to be able to play together, and it should be comical, lighthearted, not scary, but still able to show fantasy violence with swords and sorcery. In an ever more saturated game space, though, we also knew that we had to find some way to stand out while still fulfilling that need. So, being an adult with a case of terminal nostalgia, I decided that if we wanted to appeal to both kids and adults, we should shoot for a 1980s North American Saturday morning cartoon style to invoke that feeling of Saturday morning cartoons, something that would make players my age feel nostalgic, while also being accessible and fun to play for kids, while being visually unique in a cartoon visual space that's dominated by Eastern anime-style projects. There have been some amazing strides in cel-shaded 3D in the past few years, so I was certain that it was doable. But that meant, ultimately, that we decided to build our first game, multiplayer-focused, featuring high-fidelity first-person melee combat, leveraging procedural generation while still trying to have a very particular environmental visual style, and with a visual character style that runs counter to the strengths of most modern engines that prefer a PBR, realistic lit visual style. I think I skipped a page. You folks probably know what rule I broke here, because you all saw the slide. But for posterity, pick one major battle per your project. Also frequently known as start small. This was mistake number one. The right scope would have been single player with simple procedural generation, stylized characters, but not doing anything so avant-garde as cel shading in our first project, especially without an experienced graphics programmer in the studio, which we didn't have. And we should have picked the high-quality melee combat as our first battle. That would have been the smart, conservative move. I think we could have even done it really well, but nothing ventured, nothing gained. And if we wanted to escape from the world of porting, we needed to show that we could do something remarkable. Now, to be fair, we did have a strategy that was, on paper, very sensible for picking fights responsibly. A concept that one of our co-founders, Cameron Topher, calls following the golden path. You can think of it as simply the path of least resistance. Don't reinvent the wheel. If there's something that already exists that does what you want to do, use that. If the engine does something specifically well, leverage that. If there's a technical challenge that doesn't have an easily usable and available solution, there had better be a white paper that you can track down to research. And that mitigation strategy works. We made it work. The multiplayer framework of MythForce is built on top of, I'm told, the same multiplayer groundwork that Fortnite uses. The Epic-developed, technically still unsupported beta plugin, the Game Playability System, or GAS. The first-person melee combat, that was a little harder, because there's no one perfect solution or readily commercially available plugin that does all the work for us. But we're standing on the shoulders of giants with responsive, visceral melee combat in games like Dying Light by Techland and Dishonored by Arcane. Procedural generation of environments in MythForce was built using a system known as Dungeon Architect that you can find on the Unreal Marketplace that we've built on top of extensively for our own needs. And the distinct visual style of MythForce heavily references the techniques used by Arc System Works on Guilty Gear Xrd and Dragon Ball Kakarot, thanks to fantastic talks by Junya Motomura on the GDC official YouTube channel and the April 2020 edition of CG World magazine. None of the above were easy tasks, but we didn't attempt to invent any of these things ourselves without reference material. Even then, particularly, the choice of building a game with a unique visual style would require establishing an art pipeline for our characters and environment that was far out of Unreal's comfort zone. Oops. We made the mistake of thinking, however, that because we were following, or at least in the same hemisphere as the golden path, we could make this work. Biting off more than you can chew is nothing that hasn't been done before. But there's one other thing we had at the beginning: no institutional experience with any modern game engines. We had no true institutional experience with building a game from scratch. We had no real genre experience in the style of game that we were going to create. We had no established pipelines for basically anything at all. And we were missing a few key members of our team, including basically any art team at all. When we started, we were 20 people focused entirely around maintaining code for old games. As a result, we had very few people that could even truly confidently tell us what we could and couldn't do. In fact, we had 7 people, aside from me, that weren't working on Neverwinter Nights. 2 game developers, one of them sitting right over there, 1 narrative designer, and 4 programmers. Oh, sorry, game designer. He was one of the programmers. We were going to make a visually ambitious game and didn't even have a single artist on the team. We planned a game that far exceeded our available resources. That was almost entirely functional unknowns. We not only planned the project with entirely anecdotal data, but we didn't vet part of that plan with a project subject matter expert that could even tell us how wrong we were. To be fair, we didn't have one to do that, but the mistake remains the same. Excuse me. We were planning a game where 50% or more of our team would have to be hired along the way. We also thought that we could do the game that I described above with 35 people in 10 to 12 months, with only anecdotal evidence to say that that was even a viable plan. We didn't really know how many people it would take to do what we wanted, and we didn't even really know what the actual technical challenges were. Even our development director was going to be indisposed on Neverwinter Nights on Xbox for the first 4 months of the project. To clarify, every single member of that starting team were and continue to be extremely talented and dedicated, but they just didn't have the context or the background to do anything but take shots in the dark. We were living almost entirely in the lower right corner of the Johari window. That's this graph right here. Normally, this would be solved through a healthy pre-production phase of development. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that mistake later. Ultimately, we needed a team of nearly 70 people. We're still hiring for some of those positions today. If you are a production professional and you're still interested in Beamdog at the end of this talk, hit me up. We started this project with about 1/10 of the team that we would ultimately need in order to make the game that we wanted to, grossly overestimating what our existing team could reasonably do in the time that we had. The best time to have an expert tell us how wrong we were was long before we got to where we did. The second best was as soon as possible. And mercifully, we were able to quickly hire a talented art director that was as passionate about the subject matter as we were, who also had the experience to tell us what we were doing wrong from day one. The hiring process for finding an art director was tough because we not only needed someone that was extremely knowledgeable about game art process and pipelines, but we needed someone that could estimate and plan accurately. We needed someone that had just the right level of crazy to be willing to embark on a project like MythForce. That was an extremely important part of the process. If you're going to shoulder an extreme amount of risk, and make no mistake, MythForce was risky from day one. You need people that are ready for that at all levels of your organization. We had to be very upfront with our candidates while we were hiring for the position, and for every position that we hired thereafter, that we were taking a lot of big swings. They needed to be bought into the project to believe that they could do it, or we absolutely couldn't have. This, of course, has to be tempered with a certain amount of realism. We needed people that not only were willing to take a gamble on a project with a lot of unknowns, but we also needed people that knew how to get past those unknowns, who could turn uncertainty into reality. Similarly, we needed to have an executive team that was willing to accept that risk. It would be completely unreasonable to expect a company to invest in a project that was outside of our means, should the risk prove too great. We also didn't have a publisher, which means that the whole project was going to be funded out of pocket until such a time that we did have some external backing. So we needed to prove ourselves. The plan to build a multiplayer first-person roguelite was on the table from day one. There was little debate or question about its validity, but the big question mark around the project was whether the 1980s aesthetic that we were shooting for was really compelling, or if it was even achievable. What we needed was an anchor, a single reference point for the game's early ideation to revolve around, a piece of concept that everyone could point to and say, this is the game. For us, the best form that could take was a piece of concept art, a screen mock that also clearly showed off the visual style that we were hoping to accomplish. When discussing what even constituted a 1980s visual style, it became quickly apparent that everyone on the team was watching slightly different shows when they were kids. Were we shooting for the rotoscoped high-tech fantasy of He-Man, early anime-influenced style of Thundercats, the grittier look of Bakshi's Lord of the Rings or Fire and Ice, or a Don Bluth style, Secret of Nim, Dragon's Lair kind of look. We debated style for a week or two, and we settled eventually on a realistic, minimally exaggerated human proportions with low-tech, high fantasy setting, reminiscent of the Dungeons & Dragons Mystara setting. The style of the hero characters came quickly, all things considered thanks to the enthusiasm and expert touch of our concept artist, Diego Velasquez. What was left was a monster, a big boss monster, that we could use to both show off what a fantasy monster in the world of this game would look like, but also what kind of variance and scale we might want in a boss monster. And this is the piece, right here. It's printed out and hung in multiple places in our office in Edmonton. At some point, I will be stealing one of the posters off the office wall and taking it home. B-Store, as the boss here is known, is more orange now, and our environments became a little bit less craggy, but this was the anchor around which we could rally. It spurred imagination, it spurred conversation, it informed our next step. You see, GDC was on the horizon, or at least so we thought, as this was pre-COVID. But in the interest of being able to show a proof of concept of the game to potential investors, we decided to pull together a demo. I'm sure the whole E3 demo concept is one of those things everyone in the room here has at least some passing experience with. As with many game projects, being an independent studio, Beamdog had a dream, but we didn't have a publisher. So part of the work was building a demo that we could show around during the upcoming GDC 2020 that was absolutely going to happen and not be completely derailed by the global pandemic. So we hustled, as you do. We were going to make a playable diorama, if you like, showcasing how we were going to achieve the visuals of the game and what the gameplay might look like. It wasn't going to be much of a playable game, per se, but we had a team starting to roll in, so we set down a goal. Try to avoid smoke and mirrors. Build it right the first time, with the assumption that what you're seeing today is going to make it into the final product. We wanted to achieve that lofty, dreamy goal of functional, keepable pre-production that could also serve as a game demo. We wanted to be pre-production for the final game. I'm not going to say this was specifically a broken rule or a definitively a mistake, per se. I think that a demo is a fine place to do some pre-production. But a demo, especially a trade show demo, proof of concept, has different goals than pre-production. We were too focused on getting something showable for an event and not nearly focused enough on doing what pre-pro is meant for, moving us further towards the upper left corner of that Johari window, making the unknown known. The GDC demo served a purpose in that it did build hype, but it was no substitute for pre-production. And unfortunately, as it was used as that, and we did continue to do research in pre-pro beyond that point, but post-GDC, we were supposed to start actual production. So we were proverbially laying track while the train was moving. So here's another mistake for you. Pre-pro is not a trade show demo, and a trade show demo is not pre-pro. Set the right goal for the right task. Don't try to cut corners, especially with pre-production. As a demo, there wasn't really a lot in there that was real. We were building some systems, but we were working to a definitive deadline. And like most things done the first time without enough context to know any better, there were choices made in the name of delivering a demo that we wouldn't have made if we were doing pre-pro. We built what we needed for the demo, and we even spent some time building those things the right way. But in hindsight, though we spent time building those things the right way, we ultimately scrapped a bunch of it because it wasn't compatible with what we needed in the end. Speaking from a pure development efficiency standpoint, it really wasn't the best thing we could have been doing with the first few months of our development process, especially with our most senior developer at the wheel. But here's the thing. Allow me a reason, or if you like, an excuse. You need buy-in. Sometimes the most efficient path forward is not also what keeps the faith in the project. Sometimes you have to focus on keeping the hype up. I'd love to say that you should always just be able to count on the trust of your executive team that you're going to do everything just right, the perfect time, but I don't think that's realistic. Business owners are shouldering a massive risk with every project, especially in a case like ours where their belief in a project meant that we were staking the future of the company on this game. We wanted to prove that to both the studio and to publishers and prospective investors that this project was something special. And it tested well. It was a far cry from what the game would eventually become. And we'd only really scratched the surface of what we wanted to try with the cell shader technique. We went down a bit of a rabbit hole with a really cool but ultimately performance hog of a post-process effect. But the end result was still enough to build some confidence. And even more importantly, even with some of the work eventually getting scrapped, we still learned that the project had legs. And more importantly, the anchor helped us to establish and maintain the first step towards a shared, clear vision. If everyone isn't looking in the same direction when developing your game, then the risk grows that people are going to start building the wrong thing. I'm admittedly a bit of a micromanager, having a design background, but especially now that everyone's working remotely and impromptu at-the-desk meetings just don't really happen anymore for some logistic reason or another, it's even harder to see what everyone on the team is doing at any point in time. So you can't control everything. You can try, but you're just going to get in the way and you're going to make bad decisions. Instead, you have to make sure that the project vision is clear, and you have to put that vision in the hands of others. You have to trust that your team understands the project and its goals, and that they'll get the project there. Sometimes what comes out the other side is going to be wrong, but that just means you didn't communicate the vision well enough. To get there, you also need to communicate those goals effectively. In the words of Quentin Tarantino, you need to have a vision, and you need to know how to express it. I struggled with that for a while, if I'm being honest. I was, for better or worse, the vision holder, the vision creator, and for me, the vision was obvious. Of course it was. The game is my favorite things rolled all into one, and I carefully molded it in my image. But if you aren't me, how can I expect you to see exactly what I see? When you're not as articulate as some, you're not a natural speaker, you need tools. I'm reading this whole thing as I do it. The anchor, that piece of concept art, absolutely helped people to understand, even in abstract, what we really wanted to do. But one piece is just one piece. Eventually, down the line, the project will start to speak for itself. With enough care put into it, and when enough people start to come to understand the vision, that others can start sharing that and repeating the vision as well. But that doesn't come for free. You have to use the tools at your disposal, and you have to also provide what you build with those tools to others until they and the project will start speaking with your voice. Thankfully, there are a lot of smart folks that work with me. And in particular, I have to thank Dan, one of our producers on our project, for coming up with the idea of vision videos. Short 1 or 2 question videos that ask questions about the game's vision interview style that I was able to use not only to gather my own thoughts, but also to create an artifact that the whole team could refer to if they needed it later. Something that was particularly valuable for people that were new to the project or who weren't around to hear me talk about them before. Or just people who, due to everyone working remotely, don't share a space where the vision can easily take root. It was a collection of artifacts like this, images, videos, reference materials that helped to solidify the vision for at least the members of the team that were directed towards them when I couldn't communicate the vision directly or effectively. Similarly, you need to maintain that vision and make sure that it's shared and understood with all stakeholders as well. It's critically important that you're always maintaining what we call at Beamdog the hope index, a sort of subjective score of how much faith the stakeholders have in the game and the vision. If the vision was clear, the hope index was usually high. If the vision was unclear, the hope index was frequently low. It could be affected by other factors like visible progress towards goals and how on or off schedule we were, but at the end of the day, we bank on hope when making video games. And hope is frequently based on the premise of the completed project. A project with hope, even if it's running into trouble, is a project with support. And a project with support is the kind of project that ships. Not that you can ship a game with hope and vision alone. People still need to know what to do, priority, and what they have to be able to do. And they have to be able to trust that the project is being properly tracked and managed. Enter the production team, the voices that carry the vision and the hands that hold the platform upon which the rest of the team stands. At the start of the project, and really during the first decade of Beamdog, the company was a little bit of a wild west of production. It worked because at the end of the day, Baldur's Gate is a known quantity. The game existed before Beamdog did. It's just a game with a decade worth of bugs and quality of life improvements that needed to be made. And all it really needed was a Redmine database and a production team that could weigh the relative benefits of fixing one issue over another. But when it came to starting a new project, that wasn't going to fly anymore. We needed a new process, we needed structure, now far beyond what we'd ever had before. A new process, new structure, thy name is Scrum. And we went orthodox. We did backlog refinement, sprint planning sessions, poker planning. We adopted large-scale Scrum to manage multiple Scrum teams. We had end-of-sprint reviews and retros. I got my CSPO certification, and the rest of the production team got their CSM badges. We bought in hard, and we did it by the book. And to their credit, the team was also ready to give it a try as well. We even attempted to get Jira to behave. The choice to try Agile Scrum was the right one, and it was a decision that we absolutely had to make because of the disarray of pure Kanban. It just wasn't going to work with the project with the amount of uncertainty and flexibility that we were going to need. It wasn't a mistake, but what it was another challenge. Another excellent reason that we should have stuck to the golden path and picked fewer fights. Because becoming a functioning team was a fight on its own. We struggled here and there. We ran into the usual issues of transitioning into traditional Scrum, wrestled with the practicalities of shippable increments, especially early on when so many components of the project were much too large to split in an efficient way. The mistakes we really made with Scrum were inflexibility. This one's very much a production problem, but we were determined to make it work the way it's supposed to, quote unquote, while allowing the process to simultaneously get in the way of the team doing the work that they wanted to do. We got better at it in some ways. We didn't get better at it in others. And when we got to pre-early access release finally, we did abandon Scrum for basically pure Kanban. And we're still working on transitioning some of the team back into it. But still, the methodology did work, eventually. At least in the way that it allows us to continually examine our work, improve, and adapt, especially in our second go at Scrum, when we knew what rules to break. The team now is empowered to work in the way that works best for them. And through our retro process, we're doing our best to commit to working agreements and have been making some positive strides. After we loosened our grip and gave more agency to the teams to have a voice in forming the process that they want to work in from day to day, things did start to click a little bit more. It shouldn't come as a surprise, but generally speaking, your team will know what it's doing. You hire people because you believe in their competence, and that should extend well beyond just the hiring process. It's funny, but I catch myself, and I'm sure many other business leaders do, often forgetting to trust my team to know better than me what they're capable of, how we're going to get the best out of them and what they need to be successful. I find myself looking back at other highly functional teams that I've worked on in the past. Well-tuned machines with well-defined processes and honed tools, and in many cases with unhealthy work practices that prioritize work product over people. And it's easy to look at projects like that and then look at the project we're working on and go, why are we moving so slowly? Without considering the immense challenges that we face to get where we are already. And that there's a trade-off to make when you want to achieve sustainability. The engine of development in a sustainable process takes longer to get rolling. Sustainable production is a slow burn that doesn't produce the kind of immediate results that you learn to expect in more intense crunch cultures. But you have to believe in the process. You have to believe the studies saying that crunch is counterproductive. And though it's only the observation of one person, to take it with a grain of salt. But what we lack in speed at Beamdog, we make up for in gradually achieving consistency. I'd like to believe that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. I'm not going to say that we're perfect, we're far from it. I see many things that we're doing wrong. But oddly enough, when you pull on the thread of things going off the rails, it's usually either because the work was overscoped and nobody did the extra work to simplify, or that somebody was trying to go faster than they were able to and started making mistakes. Which is unfortunate because more often than not, That pressure is imaginary or self-inflicted. It comes from people not accepting their own limitations or pushing towards unrealistic goals without telling anyone that they're unrealistic. In some cases, even with the production team triple and quadruple checking whether the work they're committing to is truly viable. I honestly don't have answers for how to chip away at that kind of unhealthy, illusionary perception of some social pressure. I am neither a psychologist nor a sociologist, and I'm afraid that in this case it might be something that the individual has to get to themselves. But we do try our best to remind people that even when the project director asks for something, the ask usually comes with the implied and often explicitly stated fact that the path to those goals are negotiable. Indeed. It's homework for us at Beamdog, even today. But that trust building, getting everyone to believe that the rest of the team is working in good faith and that the goals are exactly that, goals with negotiable paths, is something that builds slowly. We found that, especially since the pandemic, we've needed to focus even more on solid and sustainable production practices. It's difficult, as it is, to effectively manage a large team at the best of time, even when everyone is in a single location, now that Beamdog has embraced a permanent optional work from home policy, with at least half of our team distributed throughout much of the rest of Canada, and a few full-time contractors outside of the country. It's become even more critical to foster both culture and healthy, organized process so the team spends as little time as possible questioning what the hell is going on. And this is really our secret weapon at Beamdog, if we have one. Culture and values. Values are the vision and the anchor of your business. I'm not going to be able to fully articulate how to define values and build culture. That's a talk that I think our COO, Kale, right there, would be far better suited to giving than me, but I will say that just like an anchor serves to ground and focus the team on understanding what the goals of a project are, a strong, well-defined set of company values that is a studio you're willing to enforce are an anchor for your business. At Beamdog, we take our values gravely seriously. Even more than experience and skill, we hire people who we believe, when they join the company, are going to be compatible with the company's values. Hopefully, even hold some of the same values for themselves personally, because we live or die by our ability to cultivate and maintain those values. Values should be your company's culture in text format. And just like the anchor, your team has to be able to point at those values and say with confidence, this is who we are. They should be what guides people into facing the same direction, and everybody in the organization should be accountable for doing their best to embody those values as well. When we defined our company values at Beamdog, I'm not exaggerating, even in the slightest, when I say that the senior leadership team spent literal weeks workshopping our values, debating individual words and their meaning, and crafting them in a way that would ensure that they were as clear and unambiguous as possible, because we expect people to understand them. These are just the titles. There's actual descriptions. This on its own doesn't do that. Just like the poster of B-Store that I talked about at our office, we keep our values in plain sight. We want people there to see them, remember them, understand them, and hopefully act based on them. We also want the team to hold us accountable to them. If I'm not living up to the company's values, I need the team to be telling me so I can do something about it. More than anyone else on my team, I need to be doing my best to embody the company's values because I have to set an example. If I'm not living our values and holding others accountable to them, that's hypocritical. If you live your values, if you don't live your values, your team won't either. There'll be folks who don't gel with your company's values, and that's inevitable, but those folks will self-select themselves out of your company. I lost my spot. Yes. Usually, because a strong culture that doesn't align with one's own is going to be rough to stay in. We've seen it. Folks who didn't like what Beamdog was eventually leave. In some rarer cases, we've even had to let go of otherwise high performers because they weren't compatible with our values. And that's an eventuality that you as a leader have to prepare yourself for. You have to choose what's more important as a business, and no matter how high a performer someone is, if they're incompatible with your culture, but you don't do something about it, that culture will fail. With all that said, I feel it's important to also say that values cannot be weaponized. They cannot be used as a bludgeon to coerce people into behaving in a certain way, even if you sometimes need to use them as a guideline that leads to a termination. They need to be a guiding light. They need to be something celebrated and something aspirational. I'd rather help someone embrace our values of their own volition, and I do my damnedest to try. It's when someone displays that they just fundamentally disagree with those values that things need to end. I'm proud to say that the vast majority of the folks that we've hired have embraced the values of our studio, and as a result, the whole studio is stronger as a result. It's an unfortunate truth that in a distributed studio model, it's hard to keep the culture cohesive, as small groups with more contact with one another tend to form their own subcultures within the greater. But as long as the larger studio culture remains the guiding light, you have to otherwise accept and embrace the positives of each. And you got to be ready to be wrong. It's through leveraging all the above things that we managed to pull through all the adversity that, if we're being honest, we created ourselves. If we'd also followed all the rules we broke, the project might have gone far smoother, but it's the practice of rolling with the punches when they come that keeps you on your feet, making sure that you have enough resilience to survive overwhelming adversity, even when it's self-made. And that's the thing. Many games sail troubled waters that are outside of their control, external factors that can absolutely hamper your ability to get to the finish line. But you also have to be able to make mistakes without fear, because mistakes will be made. When they do happen, you have to instead rely on the common ground that's built around the collective work that you've done to get beyond them. Because mistakes happen, even with the best reasons. I like to frequently remind myself of the retro prime directive, which hopefully many of you are going to be familiar with if you've worked in a healthy Scrum environment, which is, regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job that they could, given what was known at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. It's very rarely that someone will willfully make a mistake, and it's also the reality of game development, where budgets and schedules are real constraints, that some of these mistakes are going to be permanent, because you have to face the reality of being unable to do the right thing sometimes. The important thing is always that we learn from those mistakes and we apply them back into our processes. Sometimes you need to experience the fallout of a bad decision to know why you shouldn't have made it in the first place. And sometimes objective mistakes are unavoidable because of the lack of knowledge, resources, or a situation dictating that a mistake has to be made. I have no idea if this will be useful to any of you. Like I said, I'm not holding any big secrets here, but at least through doing what we did, we managed to make a great game, even if some things went wrong. And some of those mistakes even resulted in a greater game because of our ability to bounce back from them. The thesis of the talk is this: if you can survive any number of boneheaded mistakes, bad decisions, and self-inflicted headaches, as long as you keep your eyes wide open, you trust your team, you keep the vision clear, you maintain strong culture, and you are ready to change what and when you can. Thanks for your time. That's it, go home. Yes?
Yeah, so in the autumn of 2000, we started working again, and then I had a son, and then I left the company, and then 15 months later I rejoined the company, and they were still working on the game.
Mm-hmm.
And then 4 years after the first piece of code was committed to the code base, we nearly bankrupted the owner, the state where basically people were basically living around the studio.
Mm-hmm.
And in values. We released Rome Total War, and it went on to be enormously successful, widely killed us all. We made so many mistakes, and people still make those same mistakes. How do we possibly, I mean, this is a great story, but how do we possibly communicate? Don't do this. I was listening to Future of This and saying it, thinking, oh my God, if only me and Creative Assembly took years ago even done all this. How do we communicate this? How do we tell the community?
Good question. I mean, like, it feels like Well, one, so many of us in the game industry are learning by doing. There's not a whole lot of good education around this. We all kind of just mess up regularly. I have to stop myself from saying certain words. But ideally, we are making those mistakes once, and we're trying not to make them again too often. And the best way that these things work is by sort of teaching sort of the next generation of leaders how to make fewer of them. The sad thing is game development continues to get more and more complex as the industry continues to move forward. So we get new things to mess up all the time. Where, you know, there were previously difficult processes that have become easier, and then there are, you know, now things that are even more complex that we have to do. Certainly in a project like MythForce, you know, there used to be a time in my career as a game developer where you could get away with doing very little pre-production and still kind of end up making a game that wasn't a complete, you know, carnival to get to the end of from time to time. Doesn't really seem to be the case anymore. I think listening to people smarter than you is really the big thing here. Hiring people that know what the hell they're doing, and remembering that, especially, you know, someone like me, who spent most of their career in design and production, who's never written a line of code in their life, understanding that when a lead programmer says, "That's ridiculous," that you believe them, and you're like, "Yeah, but you know, just do this." Just is probably the last word you should ever use in front of a team, but. Yeah, I don't know, like, how do we stop making these mistakes without making them ourselves? I don't really have a good answer for that. But, you know, aside from talking to one another and letting each other know how many mistakes we've made and the kind of mistakes we've made, and hopefully they're like, "Oh, yeah, we're doing that too. Maybe we shouldn't." Please. Yes. MythForce is a much better game now than it would have been if we had made the right decisions. Fortunately, we were in a position where we had, you know, a strong, you know, background, a strong sort of financial standing. We weren't the kind of studio that was just going to fold up if something went really, really poorly. You know, that's not the case for everybody, obviously. But, you know, thankfully, everybody had a lot of faith in the project. And there were many times during the course of the production where we also looked at where we were going, where we were, knowing that, oh, hey, our deadline is in 3 months. That doesn't look right. But going like, in 3 months, is this game going to be good enough? And going, no, it's not. You know? Would I do it again? Yeah, I think so. I would try and avoid some of the mistakes that we made. But if it was a choice between, you know, doing what would have been the right choice ultimately to have done and what we ultimately did, I think where we ended up in the end, even with all the mistakes in hindsight, I think it was the better thing to have done. Sometimes better is different from right. Go ahead.
I would have like more comment about what he asked.
Go ahead.
So I would say like the main problem is that most developers are very idealistic
Yep.
about their project, and they don't really focus on making money. They focus on making their crazy game.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it depends on what's your goal. If you want to make money, then many of these mistakes can be avoided, I guess. But if you have this idealistic idea of I want to make this crazy game with crazy stuff, then you do more mistakes. But in the end, if you don't go bankrupt, then I guess it's fine to do it.
Yeah, I'll say from my perspective, if your only goal is to make money, do enterprise software. Don't make games. Because there's no guarantees in games. You had your hand up in the back.
Yeah, I'd say the other thing that would have made life a lot easier is one of the original 7 programmers.
Yeah.
There was some stuff that was kind of ruled out as prohibitively expensive at the time. That was kind of like Unity consulting for them to go into your game engine, help you plan and lay out some of that stuff, do like an audit of as stuff as possible, and really how to meet your goals. It's like $500 an hour, so wasn't really considered.
We only have 6 months to do this, Nolan.
If there are some costs that seem high, they're likely the alternative is more expensive, but you haven't paid them yet, so you're tricking yourself that they're not going to get paid, right?
Yeah.
So trying to, I think, saving money in some of those cases where, like, going with a game engine sometimes can be expensive, and things like consulting or like pre-production, it's probably worth it to do those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Kel.
Just to sort of layer on what Luke's saying there, as sort of the CEO of the company, one of the real objectives of the game wasn't just to make a game; it was to build a company that could build original IP. And so we knew going in we were going to stumble a lot, but that the lessons learned, however costly, were going to be what made us successful in the long run. So a lot of the choices we made to sort of try and ensure that we were learning the lessons along the way.
Yeah. It also helps to have a COO that understands that and is not going to kick your ass at every opportunity to for all the mistakes that you made. No guarantees. Go ahead.
Also, one question about sharing the vision. So you had like this screenshot at the beginning.
Yep.
And it didn't work out for also sound and music, for example. Could they transfer from the screenshot what you were expecting from the vision?
Well, the video that I showed is actually the intro to the game that came much, much later. Really was just the flat image of Beastor fighting Maggie, our mage, that was used as sort of our original anchor. So the cartoon that you saw at the very beginning is very much in line, obviously, with the vision of what the game was eventually going to become, or what the game eventually did become, because it kind of came at the end of the early access, at least development process. But the original image, although it did not encompass absolutely everything that we were going to eventually do, it's okay, my fault. I poked my USB stick. It was a way to start a conversation, basically. Yeah. Oh, we have time for one more question. Okay. One more. Who is it?
Well, I didn't have a question, but I was going to.
Please.
So we mentioned how do you prevent making some of these mistakes, and I feel like that's sometimes an unsolvable problem because it's not like a cookie cutter situation for development. For example, our team, we kind of had to make mistakes on purpose. Because of the goals of what we were trying to achieve. We were given a very limited budget, a limited amount of time, and we had to release a game in that time scale with a very specific goal of showing like a viable product so that more venture capitalists can look and like invest in the project. So we released like a project that was, I would just consider it half-baked because we were trying to get it done so quickly, but we had to also do like this weird live service thing. We're constantly updating it, keeping like this community going around and showing the investors we have a viable product, but we didn't have a proper anchor, we didn't do proper pre-production, we just were duct taping everything.
Yeah. Sounds familiar.
And then we did get like investing, and now we're in this awkward situation where we're in production at the same time, and now we have to go back into pre-production while still maintaining like showing the investors that we're still like doing stuff basically. And that's a very unique situation that's probably just for us. That might apply to a lot of indie studios. And there's like probably an infinite number of different situations people might find themselves in. So I guess the answer would be like expose yourself to as many like situations, like different different indie studios, what they had to overcome in their situations.
Mhm.
And you might happen to across some knowledge that, you know, they had a similar problem as you, but it's just a really difficult thing to find.
Yeah. The thing I like about the indie community is that we do talk amongst one another so much. It's easier to say, hey, I remember that mistake. That sounds real familiar. I think we're out of time. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.